He woke up every day before the sun rose, not because he had somewhere to be, but because sleep no longer felt safe. The quiet of the early morning wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The house felt too big, even though it wasn't. It felt empty, even when everything was in its place. The silence was loud. It followed him from room to room, never letting him forget that he was alone. There used to be laughter in that house. Soft footsteps in the hallway. The sound of someone humming in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. Now, the only sound came from the ticking clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the floor beneath his feet. He would often stop and listen, hoping, just for a second, that he might hear her voice again calling his name. She had been his world. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way. She knew how to calm him down when life felt too heavy. She knew when to speak and when to just sit beside him in silence. They had built a simple life together. Nothing fancy. Just love, routine, and shared dreams. And for a long time, he believed that life would stay that way forever. Then, one ordinary day, everything changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No warnings. No time to prepare his heart. She was there, and then she wasn't. The space she left behind was bigger than he could understand. People came to the house. They spoke in soft voices. They touched his shoulder. They told him they were sorry. He nodded. He thanked them. But their words felt like they were coming from very far away. After the days of mourning passed and the house slowly became quiet again, he realized something painful. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. Time kept going, but he felt frozen inside. He didn't know how to live in a world where she no longer existed at first. He tried to hold on to everything that reminded him of her. Her cup still sat by the sink. Her slippers stayed next to the bed. A scarf she loved hung behind the door. He thought if he kept these things untouched, she might somehow still be near. But the pain grew stronger instead of softer. So slowly, he started hiding the memories. He packed away her clothes and placed them inside boxes. He moved the photos into the back of drawers. He stopped going to the places they used to visit together. He avoided songs she loved. He avoided roads they used to walk on. He wasn't trying to forget her. He was trying to survive without breaking down every single day. He left the neighborhood they once shared. It felt like betrayal, but it also felt like the only way to breathe. He found a small place far from familiar faces and familiar memories, a place where no one knew his story. Somewhere quiet, where he could exist without being asked how he was doing. His life became very simple. He woke up. He went to work. He came back home. He ate alone. He slept alone. He repeated the same routine every day. No visits, no celebrations. No phone calls that lasted more than a few minutes. He slowly disappeared from people's lives, and they slowly disappeared from his. At work, he did what was needed. He spoke when spoken to. He smiled when required. But no one saw the quiet storm inside him. No one saw how much effort it took just to seem normal. At night, the memories came back strongest. When the lights were off and the world was silent, his mind became loud. He remembered the way she laughed at silly jokes. He remembered how she used to fall asleep on the couch. He remembered the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Tears came often, sometimes quietly, sometimes heavily. There were nights he covered his mouth just to stop the sound from escaping his chest. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want attention. He just wanted the pain to make sense, but it never did. Over time, he stopped talking about her. Not because she didn't matter, but because saying her name hurt too much. He stopped letting people get close. He stopped making plans. He stopped believing that happiness was something meant for him. He told himself that love was a chapter, was already finished, that his story had already reached its ending. He believed that surviving without joy was better than risking more pain. He buried his past quietly. No one saw it. No one noticed it. There was no ceremony. No goodbye. Just a man slowly burying his heart under layers of routine, silence, and distance. The world around him continued to laugh, celebrate, marry, and dream. He simply watched from far away. In that quiet, broken world, he convinced himself that this was all life had left for him. And he accepted it, not because he was strong, but because he was tired. Little did he know that his story was not finished. He just couldn't see it yet. He lived each day as if it were a repetition of the one before. Waking up felt heavy, like lifting a weight that never got lighter. He didn't move with purpose anymore. He moved with routine. His steps were quiet, careful, almost as if he were trying not to disturb the emptiness that had grown inside him. Even the simple tasks that used to bring small joys now felt hollow. Making coffee, checking emails, walking to work, it all felt like going through motions in a world that had lost its color. People at work noticed he had changed. His coworkers would ask questions, make small talk, or invite him to lunch, but he always declined. He smiled faintly and said he was busy, but really, he didn't want anyone to see him breaking. He feared that if someone looked too closely, they would see the cracks in his carefully built walls. He feared that if he let someone in, the pain might escape in a way he couldn't stop. Even at home, life had become mechanical. He cooked simple meals, often the same thing day after day, and ate quietly in the kitchen. The house was always clean, always in order, but it had none of the warmth it once held. He avoided glancing at the empty chair across from him, the one she had always sat in while he worked. He avoided looking at the spots where her presence used to fill the room. Each glance reminded him of the space she once occupied. He wasn't ready to face that emptiness again. He started spending time alone in ways he never imagined he would. Long walks became his escape, but even the streets he walked were unfamiliar. He avoided old paths, old stores, and old parks. He avoided any place that might bring memories uninvited. His eyes would wander over faces in passing, but he never recognized anyone. The world felt like it belonged to everyone else but him. He moved through it as a shadow, seen but unseen, touching but untouched. Sleep became another kind of challenge. Nighttime was when memories attacked with the strongest force. He remembered conversations, small arguments, silly jokes, and quiet moments that had once felt ordinary, but now felt sacred. Sometimes he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and the weight of the past would press down on his chest so hard that he could barely breathe. He would turn to his side and clutch the pillow as if it could somehow hold the part of him that was missing. Tears would fall silently, unannounced, until exhaustion finally forced him to sleep. Time passed, but he felt as though he was frozen in a loop. Weeks and months blended together, each day echoing the one before. He stopped trying to remember her fully, because remembering hurt too much. But even when he tried to ignore her, the past found ways to creep back in. A smell, a sound, a word, anything could trigger a memory that would leave him breathless. He learned to step carefully around the edges of his own mind, like walking through a room filled with fragile glass. People tried to reach him, though he rarely let them. Friends and distant relatives would call. Sometimes they showed up unannounced. He would greet them politely, nod politely, but he never invited them in. He feared that opening the door, even just slightly, might let the flood of emotions rush in and overwhelm him. It was easier to live behind walls, to answer questions with short words and quiet gestures. Easier to exist than to live fully again. Work became both a distraction and a prison. He focused on his tasks with quiet intensity, trying to keep his mind busy. He believed if he stayed productive, if he kept moving, maybe the emptiness inside would fade. Sometimes it worked. Hours passed without tears. Minutes passed without memories. He felt almost normal. But then the evening came, and the world went silent again. Then the house waited, and the walls watched. The emptiness returned like a shadow that never left. He began to notice things about himself he hadn't before. He realized he had stopped dreaming. He had stopped hoping. He had stopped imagining a future. Even the idea of happiness felt foreign. He feared it might never come again, and part of him didn't want it to. Happiness, he thought, came with loss. Love, he thought, came with pain. And he had already been given the greatest lesson in both. He tried to fill his time with small things, tiny distractions to dull the ache inside. Books were read and left unfinished. Movies were watched with half attention. Music played softly in the background, but he avoided songs that reminded him of her. Even the act of eating became ritualized, mechanical, as if going through the motions could somehow replace the warmth he had lost. But nothing worked. The void remained. Evenings were the hardest. After work, after walking through the empty streets, after routine dinners, he would sit quietly in his apartment. Sometimes he would stare out the window at the lights of distant buildings, wondering if people inside were living lives full of laughter and love. Did they feel pain? Did they grieve losses? Did they think about the past as much as he did? He often imagined that somewhere, someone else carried a quiet sorrow like his, and that thought brought both comfort and pain. He learned to live with loneliness like a companion. It was not friendly. It was not cruel. It simply existed with him. It reminded him of what he had lost, but also protected him from risking more loss. He told himself that it was better to feel the steady ache than to let someone in and risk a broken heart again. He believed that surviving in quiet solitude was safer than living with love in the world. Occasionally, strangers would smile at him on the street, and he would feel a strange discomfort. A simple act of kindness or friendliness felt foreign, even threatening. He realized that he had built walls not just around his past, but around his present. He had pushed away small joys, small connections, because he feared their loss. In doing so, he had made the emptiness his only friend. And yet, beneath it all, something small and fragile remained. A spark he barely noticed, a tiny pulse of life he did not dare to acknowledge. It was hidden beneath years of sorrow, behind the weight of memories, behind the walls he built for safety. He did not know it yet, but that spark was waiting for the world to find him again, to remind him that life could still hold beauty. For now, though, he lived quietly. Each day was survival. Each night, a silent struggle. He moved through the world as a shadow, carrying a past too heavy to leave behind, and a future too uncertain to imagine. He told himself that this was all he deserved. He told himself that love had abandoned him, and he must abandon life in return. But deep down he wondered just once if it was possible to feel alive again. He had grown so used to walking alone that the idea of encountering someone new felt strange. He had convinced himself that the world of connection and trust no longer belonged to him. Every face that passed on the street was just a stranger. Every conversation just noise. Yet, life had a way of bending the unexpected around him, and one day it happened. It was a quiet afternoon. It's one of those days where the sky was gray and the air held a soft chill. He had wandered into a small cafe he had never noticed before, drawn by the smell of fresh bread and coffee. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the faint pull of curiosity. The place was modest but warm. Filled with the low hum of conversation and clinking cups, he found a table by the window, far enough to be alone, close enough to observe. He ordered a coffee and a simple sandwich, not because he was hungry, but because it gave him something to do while he watched life carry on around him. People came and went, some laughing, some deep in thought, and he felt both a sense of longing and a sharp reminder that he was separate from it all. Then she appeared. She wasn't someone extraordinary in appearance, but there was something gentle about her presence. She smiled at the barista with a quiet warmth and carried herself with an ease he had almost forgotten existed. When her eyes met his briefly, she gave a small nod, not too bold, not too shy, just acknowledging that he existed. It was a tiny thing, but it stirred something deep inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago. For days afterward, he found himself thinking about her. Not in a dramatic, obsessive way, but in a quiet, persistent curiosity. Who was she? Why did her presence unsettle him in a way that felt both comforting and frightening? He told himself not to get attached, that the past had taught him caution, that any hint of connection could lead to pain. And yet, he couldn't stop noticing. Eventually, their paths crossed again. She was at the cafe on another chilly afternoon, and they ended up sitting near each other without planning it. Small words were exchanged. She commented on the weather. He responded with minimal effort. But even these brief moments of conversation were a shock to him. He realized how long it had been since he had spoken with someone without rehearsing every word. Since he had felt the natural give and take of a conversation, she had a way of listening that made him want to talk. But he held back. Not because he didn't want to share, but because he was afraid. Afraid that any glimpse of who he truly was would show too much brokenness and she would turn away. Afraid that even a tiny smile could become a reminder of loss if she left. Afraid that hope itself might hurt him worse than grief ever had, but she didn't push. She never pried or forced herself into his life. She simply existed alongside him, with a quiet consistency that made him notice life again. She noticed things he didn't, small details that others often overlooked, the way he always held his cup with both hands. The slight tension in his shoulders, the softness in his eyes, despite the heaviness in his expression. And rather than judging, she responded with patience, as if waiting for him to find the courage to step forward at his own pace. Their conversations grew slowly, carefully. At first, it was only words about everyday life, the weather, the food, the people around them. He found himself beginning to anticipate these moments. He noticed the warmth in her tone, the way her laughter was soft but genuine. She never rushed him, never demanded more than he could give. And somehow, in that gentle presence, he started to remember a feeling he had almost forgotten, the feeling of being seen. Not for what he had lost, but for who he was. It wasn't easy. Every time he felt himself leaning closer, letting her presence sink in, the memories of his past would rise up. He would think of the life he had buried, of the woman he had loved and lost, and of all the pain that had followed. He would pull back, reminding himself that he was not ready, that he was protecting himself from more heartbreak. And yet he could not ignore the small spark she had ignited, a tiny pulse in his chest that whispered, perhaps life could still hold beauty. He started noticing changes in himself that surprised him. He walked a little taller, breathed a little deeper, laughed a little more freely, even if only in her presence. His eyes found themselves lingering on things he had avoided for years, the way sunlight filtered through trees, the way a stranger's smile could lift a corner of his heart, the quiet hum of a street he had once passed without thought. He realized that even in the depths of his solitude, the world had been moving, living, breathing, waiting for him to find a way back, and she became a part of that quiet return. Not as a savior, not as someone who erased the past, but as a companion who reminded him that life could be experienced again. She didn't ask for explanations, didn't demand his story to be told. She simply walked alongside him, letting him find his pace, letting him explore his own readiness. And that made all the difference. There were moments of fear, moments when he wanted to retreat entirely. Afternoons when he remembered too sharply, when grief hit with the force of memory. And he felt himself slipping back into the safety of solitude. But she never left. She stayed, quietly, firmly, reminding him that presence can be a form of care more profound than words. Slowly, imperceptibly, he began to understand that allowing someone new into his life did not diminish his past. It honored it. It was not about replacing, but about continuing, sometimes. He caught himself imagining a future that he had long thought impossible. Small imaginings at first, walking together to the cafe, sharing a meal, laughing quietly at nothing in particular. Then slightly bigger thoughts, celebrating a birthday, sharing a holiday, sitting together in the quiet of a living room without the weight of absence pressing down. He felt guilt in these thoughts, for even imagining happiness seemed like a betrayal. But he also felt a tentative hope, a fragile belief that he might be allowed to feel joy again, and it was not sudden. It did not come like a storm or a revelation. It came like sunlight through a cracked window, gentle, cautious, persistent. Every small interaction, every kind word, every soft laugh, every moment of patient attention was a brick in the rebuilding of his heart. And slowly began to notice the difference. He realized he could now sit in the cafe without feeling the constant ache of absence. He could hear her laugh and feel warmth instead of piercing emptiness. He could speak without rehearsing every word, could smile without fear. could glance at life without constant comparison to what he had lost. He was not yet whole, not yet fully alive, but he was awakening. The world had not changed. The past still lived inside him, and grief still visited him often, sometimes in the quietest hours of the night. But he began to understand that life could continue alongside memory, that joy did not erase pain, that hope did not betray love lost. And he began to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, he could step into a life that included both remembrance and presence, a life that allowed him to feel again. And so, the unexpected encounter became the turning point. Not because she forced change, but because she offered a safe space for it to happen naturally. She reminded him that connection did not require abandoning the past. She showed him that the heart, even when broken, could learn to trust, even when cautious, and in that careful, gentle unfolding, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of love finding him again. Little did he know, it was only the beginning. The spark had been lit, and now it was time for him to learn how to nurture it without fear, how to step slowly but surely toward a life that had room for both memory and hope. And as he walked home that evening, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Days turned into weeks, and he began to notice a quiet shift in himself that he hadn't expected. The weight on his chest, once so constant and oppressive, had lifted just enough for him to breathe a little easier. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were still mornings when he awoke with a dull ache in his heart, and nights when memories pressed down like invisible hands. But the moments of heaviness became shorter, and the pauses between them grew longer. She continued to be a gentle presence in his life. She never demanded more than he could give. She didn't try to rush him past his grief or replace the life he had lost. She simply existed alongside him, offering smiles, soft words, and quiet companionship. She became the kind of friend who seemed to understand even when he could not explain. Someone who could sit with silence without discomfort, who never judged the slow pace of his healing. He found himself sharing small things with her, things he hadn't told anyone in years. A story from work, a memory from childhood, an observation about the world outside the window. At first, these confessions felt awkward and heavy. He would pause, unsure if he was revealing too much, afraid that his sorrow would spill over and scare her away. But she listened with patience, with warmth, and he slowly realized that he could trust her presence without fear of judgment or loss. It amazed him how much he had. He'd forgotten about conversation itself. The simple exchange of thoughts, laughter, and gentle teasing had once been a part of his life, and now it returned as if it had been waiting patiently for him to be ready. He discovered that his voice, long quieted by grief, could carry more than sorrow. He could speak lightly, joke, even challenge opinions without feeling that every word would bring heartache. The ordinary became extraordinary simply because he could share it again. Their time together became a sanctuary. Cafes, bookstores, and small walks in quiet parks became occasions to simply exist alongside someone who cared. He began to notice details he had ignored for years, the way sunlight glinted off the leaves, the soft hum of traffic in the distance, the scent of rain in the air. He realized that he had spent so long running from memory and emotion that he had stopped noticing life itself. And in her presence, he began to feel it again. There were moments when his past intruded sharply. A song on the radio, a photograph glimpsed in a shop window, a stray phrase that she had once loved. Those moments sent him into silence, sometimes into tears. But now, unlike before, he did not retreat completely. He let her see his sorrow. She held his hand once, softly, when he could not speak, and he felt a warmth he had thought lost forever. He realized that being vulnerable did not mean losing strength, it meant reclaiming it. He began to take small risks, little gestures of openness he would have never allowed himself in the past. A longer conversation, a shared meal, a quiet laugh at some absurd observation. Each time, the world felt a little less lonely, the weight on his chest a little less crushing. He remembered the old fear he had carried, that life would never feel safe, that joy was always temporary, that love always ended in loss. And he realized with a quiet shock that these fears were no longer controlling him. She never demanded answers about the past, yet she encouraged remembrance. Sometimes they would talk about loss in general terms, not only his, and he found himself speaking more freely. He could describe pain without collapsing under it, could recall memories without fear. He discovered that grief, while permanent in its mark, did not have to dominate the present. He began to see that the heart could hold both sorrow and joy, that it could remember the past while still accepting a future, as weeks turned into months. He noticed a remarkable change in the way he moved through the world. The shadows that had followed him so faithfully began to shrink. He laughed more often, sometimes quietly to himself, sometimes aloud with her. He found pleasure in small successes at work, in the taste of a warm meal, in the simple ritual of making coffee in the morning. Life, which had once been a burden of survival, began to feel like something he could participate in again. He began to allow himself moments of hope. Not grand, sweeping visions of happiness, but small, fragile imaginings. A weekend spent exploring a new part of the city. A quiet evening sharing stories. A simple meal enjoyed without distraction. Each day, each shared moment, built a bridge between the life he had lost and the life he could live. And with each brick laid, he felt a strength that had been buried for years begin to re-emerge. He noticed that he no longer flinched at the idea of connection. Where he had once recoiled from the possibility of intimacy, he now welcomed it cautiously. He learned that trust is not given blindly. It is nurtured moment by moment, gesture by gesture, word by word. And in her patient company, he learned to trust again, not only in her, but in himself. Evenings became less heavy. He would sometimes sit in his apartment, glance out at the quiet streets, and feel a sense of peace he had thought impossible. He no longer measured life only by loss. He began to feel that there could be balanced sorrow alongside joy, memory alongside presence, the past alongside the promise of what was yet to come. Occasionally, fear still whispered in the back of his mind. What if he allowed himself to feel fully, and then something happened? What if joy turned to sorrow again? What if he opened his heart and found it broken anew? But now, instead of retreating completely, he met these fears with patience. He acknowledged them, spoke gently to himself, and let them pass without controlling his actions. He realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The transformation was subtle, it's almost imperceptible, but it was undeniable. He laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and carried himself with a lightness he had thought impossible. He noticed the world with a fresh gaze, appreciating moments he had long overlooked. He discovered that life, even after tragedy, could be beautiful again not because the pain had vanished, but because he had learned to carry it differently. She had not come into his life to erase the past or to fill the void. She had come simply to walk beside him, and in doing so, she had given him the courage to rediscover himself. She reminded him that love is not a replacement for memory, but a companion to it. That hope is not a denial of grief, but a bridge across it. And in her patient presence, he discovered the possibility of living fully once again. He began to notice the small joys that life offered daily. The taste of food shared with someone who noticed it mattered. The warmth of a hand held gently in quiet understanding. The comfort of laughter that arose naturally, without effort, without rehearsal. Each moment reminded him that life had room for both remembrance and presence, for sorrow and joy, for grief and love. And slowly, he felt himself opening fully, not just to her, but to the world. He allowed himself to dream again, to hope again, to imagine a future that included happiness without guilt. He realized that life is not only about surviving loss, but about embracing what remains and what is yet to come. By the time the season shifted, he had changed in ways that were quiet but profound. The man who had walked through life like a shadow now carried light within him. He did not forget his past, nor did he pretend the pain had vanished. But he learned that life could still be lived fully, that joy could coexist with sorrow, and that love could find him again without diminishing what he had lost. He had learned a difficult lesson, that healing is not about erasing grief, but about integrating it into life. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving forward. That love does not replace memory, but teaches the heart to expand. And in this realization, he found a sense of peace and strength he had not thought possible for many long years. The days had grown lighter, and he realized he no longer feared the morning. Waking up was no longer a struggle to survive another day. It was simply the beginning of a new one. He noticed small things he hadn't paid attention to in years: the sunlight filtering through the curtains, the quiet sound of birds outside his window, the distant laughter of children playing in the street. Life was no longer something to endure. It had begun to feel like something he could participate in again. He spent more time with her now, though their relationship had never been rushed. There was a quiet understanding between them, a rhythm that had developed naturally. He had learned patience, but more importantly, he had learned to accept kindness without suspicion. He found himself opening up in ways he hadn't imagined possible. He spoke about memories that had haunted him, shared stories from the life he had once cherished, and even laughed at old jokes that reminded him of simpler times. And she listened, always with patience, always with understanding. Sometimes the past still visited him unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a scent that drifted through the air, a place he had once gone with his late wife Fit, all could trigger a wave of grief. But now, he no longer fled from it. He allowed himself to feel the sadness, and then gently placed it alongside the new joy he was discovering. He realized that carrying memory did not mean living in pain. The past was a part of him, but it no longer defined him. It could coexist with hope, with laughter, and with the warmth of another person's care. One evening, as they walked slowly through a quiet park, he noticed how much he had changed. He used to walk with his eyes cast downward, hands stuffed in pockets, trying to disappear. Now, he looked around with curiosity, absorbing the colors, the sounds, the life all around him. He smiled without forcing it, laughed without worry, and felt the rhythm of the world flowing in harmony with his own. He realized that the person walking beside him had helped him regain not just trust in another, but trust in life itself. She never demanded explanations for his long silence, nor did she rush him to embrace happiness fully. She simply offered a consistent presence, a gentle hand to hold when the weight of memory became too heavy. And in that patient companionship, he learned the most difficult truth, that love does not erase pain, but it gives the heart a reason to keep beating, a reason to keep moving forward. It is not about forgetting or replacing, but about learning to live fully alongside what has been lost. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And with each passing moment, he discovered new layers of himself. He found joy in the ordinary once more. A hot cup of coffee on a cold morning, the smell of bread baking, the sound of rain tapping softly against the window wall. These simple pleasures had once seemed meaningless, but now they brought him comfort and a sense of belonging. Life was no longer gray and heavy. It was subtle, tender, and alive. He began to reconnect with the world around him in ways he hadn't dared to imagine. He reached out to friends he had ignored for years, not all at once, but gradually. Small calls, brief visits, a few shared meals. The world had not waited for him to heal. It had moved forward. Yet now that he was ready, he found that connection was not frightening, it was affirming. It reminded him that life, even after loss, had room for joy, for laughter, for shared experiences. Work also became a place of renewed energy. He had once gone through the motions mechanically, but now he engaged fully, discovering a sense of purpose and accomplishment he had thought lost. Colleagues noticed the change, quiet confidence, a calm presence that drew people naturally. He did not feel the need to explain the transformation. It simply existed in the way he moved, spoke, and acted. But the most profound change was in how he related to love itself. He realized that love was not something finite or limited to the past. It could be experienced again, differently, without diminishing what had been lost. His heart, once so tightly closed, had learned to expand again. He could hold memory, grief, and hope simultaneously. He could feel deeply without fear, trust without hesitation, and open himself to life without worry that joy would inevitably turn to sorrow. One afternoon, they visited a small gallery together. The walls were lined with paintings that told stories of color, struggle, and beauty. He wandered through the rooms, noticing how deeply he could now appreciate the subtle brushstrokes, the quiet emotion in every piece. He realized that for years he had been unable to see, unable to feel, because the grief had overshadowed his senses. But now, with her beside him, he could take in the world fully, notice its depth, and feel alive again. Even in ordinary moments, he discovered profound gratitude. Sharing a quiet meal, walking through the park, or simply sitting together in silence, of these acts became precious. He no longer took them for granted, no longer expected life to be simple or pain-free. Instead, he cherished what was present, understanding that even small joys were victories over the darkness that had once consumed him. There were still challenges. There were still days when the ache of memory returned, when grief pressed unexpectedly, and when fear whispered that happiness was fragile. But he had learned resilience. He had learned that it was possible to feel sorrow and joy at the same time, to remember without being trapped, and to live fully without betraying the past. Each challenge was met not with panic or retreat, but with awareness and acceptance. He faced life now with open eyes and a steady heart. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking a quiet river, he realized how much he had changed. The man who once walked through life like a shadow, weighed down by grief and fear, now breathed with ease, smiled with warmth, and laughed with sincerity. He could look at her and see kindness, understanding, and companionship, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as a continuation of life itself. He thought about the woman he had loved and lost, and he realized that loving again did not mean forgetting her. Her memory remained in his heart, a sacred part of him that he would carry always. But now, alongside that memory, there was space for something new, love that was gentle, patient, and alive. He had learned that life could hold both remembrance and hope, grief and joy, past and future, all at once. He began to imagine a future he had long thought impossible. Small plans, simple joys, shared experiences, perhaps traveling to places they had never been. Celebrating milestones quietly but meaningfully, building a life that honored both memory and presence. For the first time in years, the future was no longer a source of fear, it was a possibility. The transformation was not sudden. It had taken time, patience, and the unwavering presence of someone who simply cared. He understood now that healing is not a linear path, that love cannot be rushed, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. And in this understanding, he discovered the deepest lesson of all, that life, even after great loss, can be beautiful again. He had buried his past carefully, walked through years of solitude, and learned to survive without hope. But life had found a way to reintroduce joy, gently, cautiously, and with patience. Love had found him again, not to erase what had been lost, but to help him breathe, to help him live, to help him remember that the heart is resilient. And as he held her hand, looked into her eyes, and felt the warmth of connection, he understood fully that love had returned, not as a replacement, not as a substitute, but as a companion to the life he had carried alone for so long. The past remained, memory remained, grief remained, but so did hope, joy, and the gentle certainty that life could be lived fully again. For the first time in many years, he felt completely alive. He had learned to carry his past without being crushed by it. He had learned to open his heart without fear. He had learned that love, when it finds you again, can be quiet, patient, and life-giving. And in that discovery, he found peace, happiness, and a future that was finally his to embrace. He realized that life is not about forgetting, and love is not about erasing. Life is about carrying memories with strength, opening the heart to new experiences, and allowing hope to exist even alongside sorrow. He had buried his past, walked through years of solitude, and yet here he was alive, feeling and capable of loving again. And in that, he found the truest meaning of resilience, of healing, of life itself. He had spent years believing that life had ended the day he lost her. For so long, every sunrise had felt heavy, every conversation hollow, and every silence too loud. But now, he realized that life had not ended. It had been waiting patiently for him to notice it again. The journey back had been slow, gentle, and filled with small, almost invisible steps that added up to something extraordinary. The return of hope. Mornings began differently now. The alarm still rang early, but he no longer woke with dread. Instead, he stretched in bed and felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. He would sip his coffee by the window, watching the city wake up, the world moving forward, and he felt like a part of it again. He noticed details he had long ignored: the soft glow of the sun on the pavement, the faint smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the quiet rhythm of life unfolding outside his window. Life felt real, alive, and open. She had become a part of these mornings too, not in a dramatic, all-consuming way, but simply by being present. By sharing small conversations, by letting him speak without judgment and laugh without fear, she reminded him that connection does not have to be forced. That love does not have to come with pressure or urgency. That healing is not about forgetting the past, but about learning to carry it alongside the present. Some days, they walked slowly through the streets, stopping at small shops, greeting familiar faces, exchanging smiles with strangers. Every step felt deliberate, intentional, and yet easy. He realized that he had been moving through life mechanically for so long, that he had forgotten how to enjoy small, ordinary experiences. Now, each moment was a small victory: a meal, shared without tension, conversation without fear, quiet laugh without hesitation. He began to reconnect with the world in ways he had avoided for years. Old friends received short messages that eventually turned into long phone calls. Invitations to dinner or casual get-togethers were no longer declined outright. He still moved cautiously, still guarded his heart, but he had learned that trust could grow slowly, that connections could be rebuilt one step at a time. Each moment of engagement reminded him that life was not meant to be lived in isolation. The past still lingered, as it always would. He sometimes woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, memories flooding in unbidden. He remembered her laugh, her voice, the way she looked at him with a quiet certainty. The ache would rise, sharp and sudden, but he had learned to face it differently. He let himself feel the sorrow, acknowledge the pain, and then gently set it aside, without letting it control him. He understood now that grief was not something to escape from, but something to integrate into life. With her, he began to explore what it meant to be fully alive again. She never rushed him, never asked him to replace the life he had lost. She simply existed alongside him, gently encouraging him to rediscover joy. They would sit in cafes for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes simply observing the world around them. He noticed how her presence made the mundane beautiful, how her laughter could illuminate even the quietest of rooms, and how the simple act of companionship could heal wounds that had festered for years. He began to notice changes within himself he hadn't anticipated. He smiled more freely, laughed without reservation, and felt a sense of calm that was entirely new. He realized that he was no longer living only in survival mode. He was beginning to live in a way that allowed him to feel fully, to experience emotions without fear, and to embrace moments of happiness without guilt. Work became a source of satisfaction rather than mere routine. He engaged with tasks fully, contributed ideas confidently, and even found himself mentoring colleagues with a quiet patience he hadn't known he possessed. People noticed the change in him, the subtle shift in demeanor, the calm confidence, the gentle optimism that now underlined his every action. And he realized that he had carried lessons from grief into strength, resilience, and empathy. Evenings became times of reflection and connection. He would often sit quietly with her, hands intertwined, watching the city lights flicker and listening to the hum of life outside. They shared stories, dreams, and small jokes, weaving a tapestry of companionship that was both comforting and exhilarating. He had never imagined that ordinary moments could feel so profound, but now he understood that life's true beauty often lies in these small, shared experiences. The transformation was not instantaneous. and it was never perfect. Some days were still heavy with sorrow, some nights filled with longing for what had been lost. Yet, he had learned to navigate these moments with grace. He allowed himself to feel the full spectrum of emotion, understanding that joy and grief could coexist. He realized that opening his heart to life again did not diminish the love he had carried. It amplified it, enriching both memory and present experience. He began to notice how much he had changed internally. Patience replaced impulsiveness. Fear gave way to cautious optimism. Silence, once a refuge, now became a space for reflection and clarity. He found himself planning small adventures, imagining weekends away, considering shared experiences he would have once avoided. He felt alive in ways that had seemed impossible just months before. She had become a steady force in this journey, not as a rescuer, not as a replacement, but as a partner in discovery. She showed him that love could be patient, understanding, and sustaining. She demonstrated that connection does not require perfection, only presence. And he responded by allowing himself to be seen fully, to trust fully, and to live fully. In moments of quiet reflection, he realized that he had learned one of life's greatest truths, that love and loss are intertwined, that memory and hope can coexist, and that the heart is resilient beyond measure. The man who had once buried his past, who had walked through life as a shadow, now understood that healing is not about erasing grief, but about embracing life with an open heart. He began to imagine a future with confidence. He did not rush into dreams or make grand plans. Instead, he allowed the idea of shared experiences, of mutual growth, and of quiet companionship to take root naturally. He felt the thrill of possibility without the weight of expectation. He understood that life's beauty often emerges slowly, gently, and with patience. Small joys became a source of wonder. He discovered pleasure in cooking meals for two, sharing quiet walks, observing life through the lens of shared moments. Even chores, errands, and mundane tasks became opportunities to connect, to notice, to appreciate. He learned that happiness is not always grand. Sometimes it is simply in being present and allowing life to unfold naturally. The past, while always present, no longer dominated him. He could think of his late wife with love instead of unbearable pain. He could hold memories without being overwhelmed by them. And in doing so, he realized that life had space for both remembrance and new experiences. Love, he understood, is not a finite resource. It can grow, shift, and return in forms we never expect. She had shown him that it is possible to rediscover oneself after loss, that joy can coexist with sorrow, and that hope can survive even when life seems bleakest. And he responded by embracing that truth fully. He allowed himself to imagine a future where laughter, love, and companionship were not only possible, but integral parts of life once again, as days turned into weeks and months. He noticed that the shadow that had followed him for so long was fading. His steps felt lighter, his laughter more genuine, his heart more open. Life was no longer a series of moments to endure. It was a continuum to experience fully with all its beauty, challenges, and emotions. He learned that healing is not a straight path, that grief and joy can coexist, and that love, when it finds you again, is patient, gentle, and transformative. And in this realization, he felt a profound sense of peace. The man who had once buried his past, who had walked through years of solitude, now lived fully, loved deeply, and appreciated life with a clarity he had once thought impossible, even in ordinary moments walking through a quiet street. Sharing a simple meal or sitting in silence beside her, he felt the depth of living fully. Life had returned to him, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as an extension of it. Memory and hope, sorrow and joy, past and present, they all existed together now, woven into the fabric of his heart. And finally, he understood the truest lesson of all, that love is not about erasing the past, but about allowing the heart to grow beyond it. Life is not about forgetting, but about carrying memories with strength while embracing new beginnings. Grief and love are not opposites. They are part of the same human experience. And in this understanding, He found not just happiness, but the profound, quiet fulfillment of a heart fully alive. He had buried his past carefully, walked through years of solitude, and yet here he was, live, open, and capable of loving again. Life had found him, patiently, gently, and beautifully. Love had returned, not as a replacement, but as a companion, guiding him forward, helping him breathe, and reminding him that the heart, even after immense loss, can learn to beat fully once more. He realized at last that this was what it meant to live, to carry memory and hope together, to feel deeply without fear, and to allow love to find him. In all its quiet, patient beauty, and in that moment he knew that life, with all its grief and joy, was finally his to embrace.